just wanted to share with you some moments of my journey as an out and proud gay Indian man. My journey of articulation actually began when I went away from India to MIT. I had to go away and use that space, that geography, that distance, and that perspective to, in a sense, discover my own Indian roots. I discovered them while at MIT, and while I was at MIT, it was a pretty historical time for the LGBT movement in America. During my time there, gay marriage was legalized in Massachusetts, and I happened to witness all of this all around me. And I also decided to use my time at MIT to write my master's thesis on the intersection of sexuality and technology, which then became my book, Gay Bombay. The book became a huge international success all over. It's in every library, everywhere in the world. And its publication and my decision to come out to India meant that I could no longer be in the closet like I used to be when I was in India before. But I didn't want to. Those were very, very different times. India was going through this incredible social change. In the mid-2000s, there was hope in the air. And in 2009, the Delhi High Court decriminalized Section 377. And for the first time in India's history, India's LGBT citizens had the same rights as everyone else. This was a landmark decision for a range of reasons, because the language that the judges used was of equality, was of was of being plural, was of being accepting. They cited Jawaharlal Nehru, they cited the Constitution. It was an extraordinary time to be LGBT in India, and there was a renaissance almost. People were coming out, change was happening. In my own case, I had lots of friends who were activists, in terms of the law. I had a lot of friends who were activists in terms of healthcare. There were so many activists out there on the streets. I decided to become an activist in the corporate world, a world that I was familiar with, and a world that I believed needed more activism. So I wrote articles for magazines like Forbes, where I, outed myself, and these were cover essays. I went to any company that would have me talk about LGBT issues. I went to NASSCOM forums, and we opened these forums up to diversity, including LGBT, because everyone thinks diversity is only about having more women, and it is, but it's also about including other kinds of diversity as well. And decided that I wanted to be back in India. I joined Mahindra, and my conversation with Anand Mahindra at that time was that if I come back and if I have a spouse, I want you to treat my spouse the same way as you would treat heterosexual spouses. And Mahindra said, yes, of course, we will make sure that we don't treat you any differently from anyone else. But by the time I joined Godrej, which was some years later, I wasn't that selfish that I didn't only want equal rights for my own self. I said that I want equal rights for everyone. And so when I joined Godrej, and within a week, we spoke to the management, and I said, I cannot work for a company that's discriminatory. So we changed the HR policies of Godrej to include non-discrimination against LGBT. And this is, I think it's probably one of the first, and it's still one of the only companies in India to have such a progressive HR policy for LGBT. And change happens everywhere. I decided that the corporate world was a place that I was going to make this change happen. So we're all this high, right? All this excitement is happening, India is changing. And then on 11/12/2013, our Supreme Court, in a sense, turns back this Delhi High Court verdict. Can you imagine telling people you're free, and then 4 years later saying, actually, you're not free? You're equal citizens, but suddenly, hey, you're unequal again, right? It was a horrendous verdict. The verdict itself, as well as the language used. While the Delhi High Court language was about equality, inclusion, acceptance, and citing the Constitution, the Delhi High Court language was about denying what the judge called minuscule minorities their rights. As far as I know, institutions like the Supreme Court exist to protect the rights of minuscule minorities, not to take them away after you've given them to them for 4 years. So it was a horrible judgment, and it has repercussions on healthcare, on people's lives, on the law, on the way, on almost every aspect of LGBT lives. But despite this, I'm not at all depressed or pessimistic. India's LGBT struggle is going to meet a very good and happy and successful end, and that's because of 2 reasons. The first is that you can't take the genie out and put it back in. Once the genie is out, it's out. And in any case, the Supreme Court seems to have failed to miss the point that all around India, on the ground, the general mood is that of acceptance. You talk to your children, you go to schools, you go to colleges, you go all around and ask people, what's your opinion on LGBT? They say, what's the big deal? The Supreme Court has failed to realize that the view in public, you should just come to any rally, you should look at the leadership things that are happening, you should look at the conversation on national television or in newspapers, etc. The overwhelming public view is that it's not a big deal. So I think the Supreme Court has really missed out in not gauging the mood of the people. The second and the more important thing, and which is why I was so happy to come here, is that who has a claim to the stake of this idea of India? Because if you look at the opposition to LGBT rights, it's not really about sexuality. It is about Indianness. You know, anytime I go on a television show and we have these arguments, and these people who oppose it, they come up with these two things. They say, first of all, this is against our culture. And our culture is normally something in inverted commas. And the second thing they say is, you know, what about Indian families? You know, the counter to that is that, in fact, Indian culture, historically, if you read any book, if you read our holy texts, if you read even our myths, Indian culture is all about being open, about being plural, about being accepting, especially to our LGBT and other minorities. So if you want to follow Indian culture, you should follow it by being accepting, not by accepting a silly rule that the British brought with them in colonial times, which is about 160 years old, and which almost every civilized country all over the world has rejected from their books. Even the British rejected it in the 1960s, but we seem to have rejected it for 4 years, and now we want to bring it back. I find it very strange, right? So, if we want to follow Indian culture, we should follow Indian culture by being open, plural, and accepting. And as far as families go, let me remind you, you can look at John now, of the mother. I mean, this is a mother who was very simple. Kiran Kher played her beautifully. I don't know how many of you all have seen Dostana, but in the beginning of the film, when she first hears that her son might be gay, she goes, ha, and she sings this song called Maa Ka Ladla Bigar Gaya, and she tries all these things to recover. But then when she understands it's just about loving another person, she says, well, I don't understand what this means, but I will use the framework that I know. I may not have this language of rights or equality, but I know that if my son would have brought a wife home, I would have made her do the rice, I would have maybe given her kangan, I would have said, why don't you observe Karwa Chauth? So why can't I treat my son's partner the same way and reimagine that instead of a girl, he's brought a boy home, and if this boy happens to love my son, what's the big deal? Now mothers like this don't just exist in our films. Mothers like this exist all around us. If you can see the slide in the middle, that is Sambhav, and that's his dadi. Many of you might have seen her. She's become the most famous LGBT dadi in this country because she comes on NDTV, she comes everywhere, and she says, why does my grandson not have the right to marry his partner or to live with his partner? Which court in the world is going to tell me how I should love my grandson and how, or what rights he has to get or which rights he has to be denied? Dadis like this, mothers like this, sisters like this are all around us. And it is them who are reimagining this notion of India to be plural, to be accepting, to be inclusive. Our laws will take time to change. And in any case, laws are made in courts. Courts are run primarily by men, primarily by old men. But society changes through families, through conversations, through friendships. And it's here that we women are already playing a role in Indian society, right? It's Indian women, it's our mothers, our sisters, our friends who are accepting India's LGBT children and saying that you have the same rights as all of us. So I want to end by thanking all of you in the audience. You all are amazing mothers, you all are amazing sisters, and I hope that you continue this journey of inclusion, towards all your LGBT children all over the world. So thank you very much for having me here.